All right, we're recording.
Ask everyone to please mute so that,
Yeah, thank
unless
you.
you're speaking.
Thank you. So Hugh's gonna lead us off, and I will mute myself so you don't hear the enthusiastic barking in the background.
Okay, greetings everyone. I'm going to start with just sort of, we don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to try and focus my comments. It's a very large law. I'm going to try and focus my comments on the manner and by which, what are the pieces of the industry that are going to represent the industry. How does our state propose to divide up the industry by function? And how do they propose, generally speaking, to allow those functions to be licensed, and what are their approaches, and how that ties in specifically to municipalities, and more specifically than to Princeton.
Hugh, I'm just going to interrupt for a second. Both for Hugh and for Trishka, they've indicated that they're happy to take questions during the presentation. So if you do, sorry, I meant to say that before, if you do have a question, raise your virtual hand or your real hand, and I'll call on you. So sorry about that.
We'll also take questions at the end, so don't feel like you have to.
Yeah.
Yes,
You're not compelled while we're talking.
That is true.
Feel free to.
Yeah. And if I get anything wrong, bail me out. I know there are people here that can just correct me and say, no, I don't think that's right. Because there's a lot as we're trying to look through this law, and this is generally the task of this task force. As we're looking at the law, and in the absence of specific regulatory language from the commission, which hasn't come out yet, we are kind of stuck with trying to figure out how, and maybe guesstimate a little bit about how the law is actually going to be proposed to be implemented. And I know there is going to be, and there is already some uncertainty around specifics, which matter a great deal for the municipality, which actually has to make the decision in some very specific areas. The fundamental issue, I think, before Princeton and every municipality is whether to opt in or opt out of adult use cannabis. In the state of New Jersey, the state allows for a municipality to pass an ordinance within 180 days of the effective date of the law, which we know brings us into August. But I think because of some of our legal requirements, otherwise municipalities, really the decision would need to be made by June. The opting in or opting out could be, there's some flexibility put into that. Municipality can opt out of the entirety of the cannabis industry, or can opt out of any particular piece of the supply chain. And I use the term supply chain because when we look at how the state determines the functional license types, it's based upon the supply chain of that industry. And I'll get into what that supply chain looks like as far as our state is concerned in a moment. So what our town and any town can opt out of the entirety or opt out of any piece license segment of the supply chain. And if it does opt out, it can, as my reading, I know there's some dispute out there, but I'm fairly confident that any action to opt out can be reversed at the town's discretion. So part of what we're wrestling with is what I hope is we're wrestling with an administrative decision, right? So if we were to opt out as a town, it would only be because we wanted the regulators to provide the full set of regulations to best inform us as to how we're going to approach cannabis in Princeton. And not because we think that cannabis itself is, that the prohibition of cannabis in Princeton is something that we want to do based upon other considerations, moral or otherwise. So I'm thinking in an administrative context, we have our 180 days. If we're reticent or uncertain about what our ordinance could do, we could opt out and then opt in as soon as we see and are satisfied with the regulatory approach taken by Cannabis Regulatory Commission. If we don't opt out, we can opt out after 5 years, right? So after 5 years, we can opt out, but anyone that's already in business that's in the town will be able to continue, will be grandfathered in. So that's sort of our opt-out piece. If we fail to, part of the ordinance would involve coming up with zoning, right? Zoning provisions. Probably also any licensing or endorsement requirements would be things that we would put into that ordinance. But at a minimum, it is a decision to opt out whole or in part, and then the zoning. Failure to do that within the 180 days means that we have opted in and that the default zoning in the bill kicks in, which is for retail establishments, any retail or commercial zoning would work, and industrial zoning for the other pieces of the supply chain. So what are the supply chain, or what we call types of functional licenses? They are cultivation, which is obviously the cultivation of the plant. Cultivation for, in by and large in the state, has meant and will likely by and large continue to mean the cultivation of cannabis within a greenhouse or within a warehouse, right? Indoor cultivation, these tend to be larger facilities, but they don't have to be. The next part of the supply chain is manufacturing. Manufacturing is the taking of any derivative, any packaged good or derivative of the cannabis plant. So with that, we would be thinking of oils, concentrates, edibles, tinctures, topicals. Any of those productions would fall under a manufacturing license. To date, we have very little manufacturing going on in our state relative to the amount of flower that we have, which is actually unusual when we look at other states, but that will change. It's driven primarily by the sheer lack of flower or lack of biomass that's necessary to sustain flower sales plus derivative sales. But what we tend to see, and this is quite frequent in the Northeast, and what we'll likely see for a while, is that traditionally, at least in the extraction sense of manufacturing, those types of functions tend to be united, often even physically in the same location as a cultivator. So currently, right now, we haven't yet have any industry that is licensed according to this new schema. To date, one license type provided for all of the functions. So our current industry is called vertically integrated. What we're dealing with here is the separation of those functions by different pieces of the supply chain being segregated by owners. So that's the manufacturing piece. The next piece is retail, which is the storefront, often called dispensaries, and called dispensaries in the medical context. And then we have 3 other licenses that are somewhat exotic, and it's unclear when they will really work. The first is a wholesaler license, which would allow for a party to wholesale and to purchase flower and packaged goods and then resell them to retailers or dispensaries. So basically a middleman operation. There's a transporter license, which would allow someone with to move products in the wholesale channels. So to move flower from a retailer, from a cultivator or a manufacturer to retailers, or from a cultivator to a manufacturer. The wholesaler function is not requisite, and nor is the transporter license requisite. A cultivator or a manufacturer can do their own transportation and their own wholesaling, but we did add these pieces in. And then finally, we added in a delivery license. And the delivery license, the view on the delivery license is that it's a courier type delivery service function where the license holder is able to engage with a retailer and to for some cut of the economics, deliver cannabis from the retailer to the consumer. Unfortunately, I think there's a really great attempt to add license types with lower barriers to entry, and delivery is a lower barrier to entry license type for sure. And in fact, there's the way we set this up in our state law, the way the state set up the law was that there would be some considerations, particularly for social equity applicants around delivery license. And that's not unusual. This is a really interesting feature of the way Massachusetts is approaching delivery. And that sounds great, except for the fact that we realize that one, the most important feature is that our retail establishments can deliver on their own. So it would have been really neat from a social equity point of view if the retail establishments, at least for a period of time, were not eligible to do delivery and had to line up with delivery companies. That's sort of a Massachusetts development, which is really, I think, quite positive. But we don't have that, so that's why I say it's difficult for me to understand right now, especially given how nascent our actual industry and marketplace is in New Jersey, when we're going to see wholesalers, transporters, and deliverers license types actually be meaningful. And so I'm going to sort of disregard those at the moment, because the real focus, and at least for right now and the time being, is going to be on the big three: cultivation, manufacturing, and retail. We taking a look at what a cultivation facility, the types of requirements the cultivation facility needs and size. At first blush, you know, and probably the case, Princeton is probably less likely candidate than other municipalities for having cultivation facility. I would hope when we get to the point of participating in the industry, we would allow for cultivation. There are micro cultivators. There are cultivation possibilities. I hope we wouldn't opt out of it, because cultivation potentially has among the lowest infrastructure impacts of any license type, but has the potential and probably is definitely the largest revenue source for a community. And when we get to the micro style of licensing, it's not off the table, right? Or even a smaller cultivator. So over time, it could make sense. The tax rate for the three license types that I think, including cultivation, manufacturing, and retail, the tax rate is that we're allowed to impose is 2%. That could be quite nice for. It's difficult to know what that means in terms of revenues for a cultivation facility, because we would not have, you need to know the size of the cultivation facility and the projected output therefrom. And it's difficult to understand that for Princeton. So I think what I would suggest with regards to cultivation is we just sort of say, yeah, you know, maybe we find a place where it makes sense and see if anyone can make it work. So if we have some industrial zoning or anything like that could potentially work, or some area that we could zone for it, maybe out in the sort of Skillman, the Montgomery border, there might be something there that could work. The next piece, the manufacturing piece, again, is 2% revenue. It's also difficult to understand. This one's sort of the most exotic piece, because the manufacturing of cannabis derivatives includes a tremendous amount of variation. Everything from the whole range of beverages and foods through the range of concentrates, which have strange names like, you know, batter, honey, wax, shatter, diamonds, and then of course the oils, right? So for vaping purposes, vape cartridges, etc. Those could be really they're also where brands settle in. So in one way of thinking about the future of any type of consumer industry, brands are supposed to take a really strong, prominent position in the economics and consumer preference. So a manufacturing facility is something that it's a little unclear. It could be a tremendous windfall for the town if the operator, if the license holder has a great brand or develops something that's really exciting and is captured a lot of market share. So I mean, that could be really exciting to see happen. And also the infrastructure impact for manufacturing is very low as far as the state's concerned, both in the terms of cultivation, manufacturing. Goods are shipped in and out in van size. And van size is not in 18-wheeler trucks, and no one's going, there's no consumer direct interface with any of those types of businesses. They just occur. And that those make a great deal of immediate sense because they're so innocuous as far as infrastructure hit, and there's money on the table for them, for the town, from those operations. The next piece, and this is the one that we really all captures our imagination, is retailer dispensing. The retail and dispensing is a storefront. It's intended to be a storefront where people, consumers go in and buy processed goods or buy flour. The retail license is allowed to conduct storefront activities, but it's also allowed to conduct delivery activities. And it's also allowed to, with the towns opting in, it's a little exotic and maybe down the road, allows for social consumption facilities. Now, we should take a minute to just think about retail in light of a couple of features. One, the tax rate. The tax rate as well is 2% the municipality can levy onto the activities of the retailer. And I think that it's not inconceivable that I think the range of revenue that we could see from a retailer in actual dollars is probably $300,000 to $500,000 annually for a facility in our community. I don't know we don't know what the full rate, where in that range, or if there's exceeding or below the range, what the predicates for that, for understanding how that could work out. We're not totally clear on that because we haven't really seen how delivery would play out, and it is a little dependent upon opt-in and opt-outs of other municipalities around us, the ability or the size of the retail facility to be able to handle other functions like delivery, and we don't really understand what social consumption would mean really anywhere in the country. I mean, there's some social consumption going on, I think now in Chicago and LA, Southern California, I should say, and Las Vegas. But these are all new and sort of like difficult to get our hands around. So trying to understand what that stabilized revenue rate would be depends on a lot of factors. But there's a range that at least initially we could get our heads around. It comes at a bit of a price to I mean, it's a bittersweet price to the community. The infrastructure, at least in the early years of having retail in our town, we could expect some stresses on that. There's huge demand in Massachusetts, for instance, and in Illinois, which more recently went adult use. We see gigantic lines outside of dispensaries. And when dispensaries are located in sort of urban, more walkable settings, as opposed to like, out on Route 1, those lines can be, and the parking attendant to those can be problematic. Now, there are lots of workarounds that people figure out. There are ways where scheduling is required. I know Brookline is requiring, in Massachusetts, requiring a new dispensary there to do schedule, to require that the consumers schedule their visits. In response to the fact that gigantic lines are frustrating municipalities and they're costly to manage. And the parking that goes along with them are actually very stressful. The good side of that is that's a lot of foot traffic for other businesses. Right. So it kind of goes back and forth as to how to look at that. But we should be prepared, at least in the early stages of an adult use rollout in New Jersey, for extraordinary demand and for dispensaries or retail facilities in our state, given the low level of accessibility that we have and the traditionally slow rate at which we've been able to diversify and increase the accessibility of cannabis just in our medical market. It should be a matter that we really think about. I could see us going adult use, depending on how we do it, having some real infrastructure stresses by just demand, just consumers showing up to the town. So that's the major food groups of the supply chain. One little caveat: there are micro versions of each of these, which may be appropriate. So in the traditional setting, the license holder has to be subject to a huge amount of criteria. Has to display and be sort of scored appropriately, meet a number of other basic criteria to even obtain a license. The micro license of each of these are what they say, they're smaller versions, but how much smaller? and what are the requirements for the micro license. So a micro license for cultivation, and this is one reason why I said maybe we think about cultivation. All micro license facilities have to be owned 100% by New Jersey residents. They have to be 51% owned and employed by, and the employees taken from the community in which the micro license is. So it would be, or an abutting community. So it would be either 51% of the ownership and the employees of a micro license would be from Princeton or one of the surrounding communities. There's a limit to just 10 employees and a total square footage of 2,500 square feet for the business. And in the case of a cultivator, 1,000 plants in that 2,500 square feet maximum. And then there's a maximum limitation on the amount that can be sold in, say, a micro retailer. 2,500 square feet is not terribly micro by our downtown standards. And a micro dispensary or retailer, for instance, can sell up to 1,000 pounds of cannabis flower and equivalent derivative materials, which is just a gigantic amount of it's not very micro either. So those are actually kind of interesting around our supply chain. So this is sort of things that we're going to need to try and get our heads around is when we think about what types of businesses we should be approaching in this town and how, as far as the functionality goes. Now we look at the way, now let's take a quick look at some considerations on how Princeton can sort of interact with forming once we determine what types of licenses we want to have, what are our toolkit potential trying to interact with the potential pool of applicants to have other policy considerations that matter a lot to us be present in the operator in our town. That's a really good concern. I know social equity is a big concern, as it should be. And what can we do as a community to affect something positive here? Are we limited? And I think the way we look at the way the application procedure works is that the applicants, micro licenses aside, the applicants need to provide as part of their application to the commission two pieces of that impact our town or any town. One is a letter affidavit stating that the proposed location in the municipality of the business meets with zoning. And two, a letter of support, local support, where the town says that they support this business being in their town. That has to go into the full application that's provided to the commission. Once the commission has an application, apparently, this is new, it'll send the application down to the town within 14 days, and the town there's no time frame but indicated in the law, the town needs to reply that in the affirmative that this meets with its time, place, manner, location, and number restrictions. So part of an ordinance would cover these topics, right? Time, the times, the places, the manner, and the number of businesses that are there. It would have to say that is something that this license meets with that. And so that sets up an immediate sort of like worry, like, well, wait a minute, on the first hand, we're saying we support this business. On the other hand, are we just checking the box that our ordinance lays forth these various things and as a result, we're kind of stuck with it. How do those two things line up? And especially when you have number in there, if you say you're only going to have two businesses, is it just first come, first serve? What is there some sort of lottery, whatever there is? But what we do see is that the municipality does have the ability to put licensing requirements and endorsement requirements. And I guess this means that we as a municipality, or that a municipality can and maybe this is how it all works. There's some sort of licensing requirements or procedures that we would put in place, and we would interact with businesses that want to come, potential businesses for our town. We would interact with them. We would have a method for determining our position with respect to the limited number of potential slots that we have for businesses in our town, and whether they met with our whatever the requirements that we want to put in place are, and perhaps that's how the letters of support would work. from that process. Then that way the applications going to the commission that are valid that have our sort of imprimatur are understood because they've already gone through our licensing process. And then when they come back, it's just a matter of checking to make sure, yes, this is the business in question. That's how I've been trying to get my head around these pieces of how it would look. Absent regulations for the licensing schema that the commission is going to actually utilize, I'm just reading the law and trying to piece it together. But I don't have the sequence of events or the order of operations because this is down to the commission, and the commission has a great deal of latitude in what it's doing, and we have a great deal of latitude about it. So if we think about, if I'm correct, and we have this ability, and I think we do, where we can provide a structure and a process to make sure that businesses entering our towns meet with the considerations that are important to us as a community, I think we have a fair amount of latitude in decision making. But of course, we would have to come up with some sort of licensing view, right, that we'd have to put out there. Generally speaking, and there's a lot to work with in tandem with what the state's going to do. I mean, part of our commission is the establishment of the Office of Minority, Disabled Veterans and Women Cannabis Business Development. And part of that goal and part of our commission is to ensure that social equity considerations are found throughout the industry, that we end up with a diverse a diverse industry in our state, that things like women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, those certified by the Treasury Department, are actually verified as so by this office. So there's a lot to think about how this needs to work. If someone's getting verified, or does that happen by this office in the application process? Does that happen prior to their submitting the application? Does that happen after they've submitted the application? We don't know. Could we, as part of our licensing requirements, kind of look to some of the state rules, state law aspirations, and say that we want to mimic those, or that we want to be selective amongst those, and we want to find, for instance, we would have a preference for a women, minority, or veteran-owned, certified and verified business by the office, the office of the commission, if that's something that cannot be before. But in the absence of some of the regulations around how the commission is going to deal with this, it's difficult to kind of project. So I know that was a lot, and I've taken up more time than I was allotted. And I apologize to be a bit stammery about this, but it isn't really clear. We don't have a straight set of order of operations, and what's more, we don't even have the full context available yet, because the commission, that's the commission's job to do. But as far as I can tell, the one thing that makes certain, I've kind of asked around a little bit, see if I'm crazy, is that we can add licensing and endorsement requirements. Just one little aside, just briefly on the consumption lounge piece. Everywhere else, when we're working on, they use the term endorsement for a consumption lounge, not a license, not a separate license class. It's an endorsement that a retailer can get. So what do we mean by endorsement? So I think it's an add-on to the retail license. The endorsement area is, for the municipality, everywhere else, it's you're opted in until you opt out. For the social consumption endorsement, that's an actual opt-in, right? So there, the town would have to decide that it's going to allow for social consumption, and until it does so, social consumption would be prohibited. And what's a social consumption lounge? It's what it says. It's basically like, I guess its inspiration is drawn from the coffee shops in Amsterdam, for instance. It's a place where people can consume cannabis, with no alcohol can be present. It can be done within a building. It can actually be done outside, and with a variety of restrictions on that. But that's something as well that will eventually be, that's going to come our way, right? Because these will get going. I think they'll probably start in Atlantic. I know Atlantic City is interested in those for obvious reasons. I could see Asbury Park being interested in them. Maybe some other communities might surprise us and be interested in them, but they're going to come our way. So it is something we do need to think about. So with that, I will conclude my long comments, but are brief in relation to the gigantic legislation that we're looking at.
Eve, if I can just cut in, having listened to Hugh's really, I have to admit, great presentation, and I'm probably going to send a recording of this to some of my other clients. This was really good. But there were certain things that he brought up that I actually, I'm also going to want to get into. And what I was actually going to suggest was, why don't I do that now? Because that may actually either forestall or address some questions that people may have, and may help to focus things a little bit.
That was always the plan, unless somebody had questions. But just to put a little holding place in it is, I did want to ask Hugh and maybe Trishka, if you know as well, to talk a little bit about the potential timeline for some of these things happening, because it's not going to be like tomorrow or next week, but we can get
Correct.
back after.
Yeah, let's go back to that, because I'll probably touch on that a little bit, and Hugh
Trishka's
can
our
also hit it.
municipal attorney, so I'll turn it over to you, Trishka. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Eve. So as Eve mentioned, I'm the attorney for Princeton. I also represent other municipalities, and I'm working on a committee with the league, wrestling with a lot of the issues that Hugh was bringing up at the very end. So I'm really just going to hit this from the sort of the legal and regulatory aspect, and then try to outline, I think, for this task force, what I think you guys should be focusing on, and then also what you should not be worrying about, so that you don't feel like you're having to deal with everything, right? Because I think there's some of the things that Hugh raised that I don't want you guys to get bogged down in, because there are other people, namely me, who can get bogged down in that stuff instead. So, just going back, in terms of what's regulated at the state level versus what the municipality is able to control. I would say that 99% of the power is resting with the state. This is an unbelievably prescriptive and detailed piece of legislation that I actually find fascinating, just as a regulation, because you don't normally see something quite this long and comprehensive. But really what the municipality has control over, as Hugh said, and I'm just going to underscore some stuff, whether to allow any of these classes of cannabis businesses in your town. So in that way, it's similar to alcohol licensing, right? Towns are allowed to be dry. And really the overall intent of this statute, I think, is to approach, well, it says it blatantly in the legislative findings. The state is attempting to approach this the same way that it approaches alcohol licensing and alcohol regulation. So have that in the back of your mind in terms of what you can do at the municipal level. So you can decide basically to be the equivalent of a dry town and simply not allow any of this within your borders. You have initially until August 20th to make that decision. You can opt to be a partially dry town, so you can allow certain types of cannabis businesses and not others. But whether it's a total opt-out or a partial opt-out, August 20th is your date, and after that, your window closes for 5 years. So as the attorney, frankly, I am urging all of my clients, opt out for now, protect yourselves, and then buy yourselves the time to figure out what you actually want to do. Hugh, I agree entirely with Hugh's reading of the statute, and this is something I've actually had to really dig into in the last couple of weeks. To me, it's pretty clear. You have until August 20th to opt out. You can opt in at any time. So you can always relax your regulations. You cannot tighten them up after August 20th in terms of, a prohibition. So to me, and August 20th is almost on top of us. This does not give towns very much time to figure out what to do, especially when you couple that with the fact that the Regulatory Commission has 180 days to issue its initial set of regulations. So we don't even know, what a lot of this is going to look like. So, but to be clear, even if you opt out completely now, you could decide on August 22nd or August 23rd to opt in. There's no deadline for that in the statute. So obviously, my view is, and this is one of the initial decisions for this task force, whether to opt out completely at this stage. It's what we're calling a placeholder ban. My recommendation is to impose a placeholder ban so that you actually have time and you're no longer under this very strict deadline to figure out all the different issues and what the options are and what you might or might not want to allow. Once you decide to allow some of these businesses, as you mentioned, you can control the location, you can control the number, you can control the type, hours of operation, that sort of thing. A lot of the majority of the licensing requirements are all held at the state level. There's going to be terminology things like licensing versus local permits. The licensing is at the state level. At the local level, I think we can impose permitting requirements. This goes to some of what Hugh was talking about in terms of, what would constitute a municipal approval of an application. But a lot of that is actually really technical and legal, and that's not something I want this task force to get bogged down in. To me, what this task force really needs to focus on is the substance and the policy that the municipality is allowed to regulate. So again, do you want to allow anything? If you want to allow, what do you want to allow? Where do you want to allow it? How many of the different types of businesses do you want to allow? What kinds of limitations do you want to impose on hours of operation? That sort of thing. All of that is these are questions that the lawyers can't answer. These are just pure policy questions. And I think that's where the task force should focus. Once you've identified the answers to all those questions and you've figured out the what, right? And you have your whole list of recommendations in terms of what should be allowed or not allowed, the how, the mechanics that Hugh was talking about in terms of what's the zoning regulation, what are some of the permitting requirements, what are the mechanics in terms of, the timing, like, do you have somebody come and apply for a permit before they go to the state? All of that, frankly, is really legal and very technical. There are a lot of rules already established in the case law, just in terms of municipal regulation generally. So what I would urge the task force is leave that to me and to the staff to figure out, but we cannot figure that out until we know what your recommendations are in terms of what to allow, what not to allow, and under what conditions. And then we'll figure out how to structure it and how to, put together what we believe would be a logical and a correct process. So that is really what I want you to focus on in terms of your next steps and your decision points. In terms of process, so Hugh will probably know better than I will. There's some initial bunch of sort of different deadlines within the statute. I mentioned the Regulatory Commission has 180 days to issue regulations. And the regulations are going to put a lot more meat on what's already in this statute. And it's hard to believe that you need more meat, given that you're already dealing with a 240-page statute. But believe it or not, there are still some ambiguities built in here that I think the regulations will address. There is also, initially, the commission is only, I think, Hugh, it's 37 licenses, and I believe that initially it's just cultivator licenses that are being issued. It's a very limited universe. And there are built-in delays before, for instance, retailers can come in. So I think some people, based on comments in some of my other towns that I've heard from the public, I think some people think, like in 6 months, we could have retailers in every strip mall generating foot traffic. And the answer is no, you can't. That there's initial sort of delays that are built into the statute obviously I don't have them at my fingertips. I'm really hoping that Hugh will, and when I shut up, he'll be able to answer that. But then in terms of just the process on the legal end, so as I said, August 20th is your deadline if you're going to prohibit anything. To pass that type of ordinance would take about a month, 6 weeks at the outside. We actually have one that could get introduced right away. It then would need to be referred over to the planning board because some of it belongs in zoning. The planning board would review it, report back, and then it gets adopted. So it's the same process as any ordinance. And normally, as I said, that takes, between 4 and 6 weeks. In terms of once the task force has decided, what, if anything, to allow and where and under what conditions, that's going to take a while to develop. And then in terms of the drafting of that type of regulation, it's hard to give you a firm idea of how long that would take, but that could take a while because I think Hugh did a great job of identifying all the different moving parts. So even at the local level, the regulation itself is going to be, there's going to be some complexity to it that's going to have to be worked out at the staff and the legal level. But then once that's done, it's the same process. It's 4 to 6 weeks to pass an ordinance. And really what would take, I think, the longest is just developing the standards and doing the actual drafting to make sure that we get it right. And that last part, making sure we get it right. And this circles back to why so many of us are recommending these initial placeholder bans. Normally, with any type of ordinance or local regulation, obviously you want to get it right the first time, but that if there's something you missed along the way, you can always tinker with it, amend it, roll it back to deal with the unknowns. What is so, do I want to say troubling or scary now? I don't want to use loaded terms like that, but the difference here is the legislature has constrained municipalities' ability to do that kind of tinkering and rolling back if in fact they don't get it right the first time with their opt-in regulations. And this is why I think it's especially critical here to really look at this carefully and figure out what you want to do and really do try to get it right. Because if, for instance, you just sort of make an off the cuff, not that you guys would, but if a hypothetical municipality, just made sort of an off the cuff, let's just allow the retail everywhere in our downtown without stopping to think of some of the impacts that Hugh identified. And then all of a sudden they realize, wow, that was a bad idea. We don't want them in the downtown. We really should have them actually on the outskirts. Too late. Can't do anything about that for 5 years. So it's, or if you decide you want to prohibit, that's the piece that as an attorney bothers me. And that's why I think the placeholder ban becomes so important. Obviously, there's messaging issues. You want to make it very clear that this isn't, we're just rejecting recreational cannabis out of hand, unless that's really what the task force feels should happen. But I think that is what is going to give the municipality the maximum amount of protection and is going to give this task force the ability to take the time that it needs or that it wants to take in coming up with its recommendations. It just gets rid of that August 20th deadline looming over your heads. So that's sort of roughly what I wanted to go over. Again, just underscoring, you can only opt out until August 20th. You can opt in at any time. Focus on the what, not the how. And, just study the issues carefully. There's just a lot to look at in terms of the options at a policy level and the impacts.
Thank you very much. Hugh, go ahead.
Trishka, and I apologize for what I'm about to do, but I think it's important. Trishka, can we take a look at the opt-out provisions, the municipal ordinance provisions? Look at the word cannabis establishment in there. I'm not so sure this is requisite for medical licensing.
That's correct. Yeah, medical is dealt with separately.
Right, and I think in
And
medical, it's if I'm right there, that's actually kind of interesting because in the chance that we see a medical
yep,
process before we see an adult use process, I think in the traditional medical, it's really the town can sort of determine ad hoc, right? They don't have to have an ordinance one way or the other. They could say, here's our local support, letter of local support for the.
I believe that's the case. I believe that's the case. I have a colleague who actually really knows and understands the medical, and I could put that question to
Yeah.
him to get a much more detailed answer. But that's the case, and I think what you raised is a good point. So the section in the statute that I just went over very quickly, in terms of the what the municipality can regulate at the local level, that's all dealing with these recreational cannabis, adult use cannabis businesses. That is separate from the medical cannabis. And medical cannabis, it's a different statute that regulates it. There is some overlap in terms of what are known as the alternative treatment centers and the medical cannabis statutes. There are certain things that they will be able to allow, like the consumption area, that sort of thing. But in general, they're pretty separate. And I can absolutely, as a follow-up, get you more detailed guidance on that. And frankly, on a lot of stuff in this statute. I think as you start to develop more specific questions, we're going to be able to generate a lot of follow-up. But it is important to realize that they're completely separate. And even, for instance, at the cultivation level, they're very different. And it's different regulations, different requirements.
Yeah, I think that's something that we'll need to hear more about what
Yep.
the options might be for medical, and we can save a detailed discussion of that to
Exactly.
another time. And I see a couple of people have questions. Hugh, did you want to add anything before?
One little thing. They aren't going to meet their deadlines, right? The commission it will not meet their deadlines on. I mean, they just won't. They might do piecemeal regulation, right? They might do some piecemeal regulation, like enough to launch. And by the way, they would have to do medical regulation to some degree as well, because the medical regulations don't actually, the current medical regulations don't actually reflect the medical law as amended in 2019. So they still would have to do that as well, but they have a little bit more largesse, I think. The only other thing I wanted to mention is on the licensing. There's 37 cultivator cap, 24 months from the date of the law being passed, but that's fully permitted or fully licensed, and that means like where we can have no more than 37 that are basically licensed to conduct harvest, right? So and that's the only statutory cap we have. The right sizing of the industry beyond that is left up to the regulator. I think that when we see a licensing process, it's potentially, I guess I should say, the case that it'll have a lot more than 37 cultivators because they only have to, like, it's really the 37 being fully permitted or licensed means that they're ready to open their doors. So I think the need will be to get more licensing. It takes at least 18 months to open up a sizable cultivation facility. So by the time we actually go through our application process, this restricted period is going to be a nullity. But it would be, by the way, we only have 10 or 11 currently in operation of the 37. So I think that the other thing is there's a requirement that I think 10% of each license class, an amount equal to 10% of each, or 10% of each of the license classes that are out there have to be total number of licenses have to be micro licenses. So and micro licenses aren't factored into the cap on cultivation. So we'll see micro in any process that comes out. I think we're going to have to see micro licenses at least being counted into that, and I think that they can size the supply chain as they need to. But one area that I certainly think is exactly right, that even if I'm correct that that's the case, they're going to need to stage their application requests and starting with cultivation. So they're going to have to probably start with cultivation just because the burden of reviewing applications is so much, and the time frames of not the review, but the build out and getting operational for each of those each of those licensing classes are such that it makes sense to start with the longest and most complex, which would be the cultivator, and then move on from there. But again, we don't have the regulations on any of this, so we don't know. This is just me sort of like musing, I suppose. So sorry, I just wanted to put those two things in there. And this all goes to underscore, Trishka, what you were saying is though we have a gigantic bill, we still have just still very perplexed.
Although in fairness, I think even as some of the things that were just going through my head as Hugh was talking, and again, this goes to things for the task force to look at. For example, cultivation. In order to know whether you would want to even allow cultivation in Princeton, you're going to need to know what does that look like? What are the limitations? Can it take place indoors, outdoors? Well, there's a ton in this statute in terms of what a cultivator is or isn't allowed to do. For example, the operation must be entirely indoors. It cannot be outdoors. This isn't relevant to Princeton. It's relevant to a lot of the more agricultural communities in Princeton. It cannot take place on farmland assessed property. It is not entitled to right to farm protection. So, and that's going to be the same with every single one of these businesses. There is a lot in the statute with respect to each type of business, what is allowed, what isn't allowed. For retailers, what are they allowed to advertise and where? For instance, they cannot advertise within a certain distance of a school. So there is an incredible amount of detail in here. And I think probably at the subcommittee level, as you guys start to roll up your sleeves and really look at these questions, you're going to want to look at, some of the impacts that Hugh identified, for example, with the retail. I would say with cultivation, one of the things that I've been hearing is, some of these cultivators require enormous compressors that can have noise impacts. I've heard about odors emanating. I don't know to what extent it's true or not true. These are things you would want to look at. But I think you are also, and again, our office can provide this guidance, you are also going to want to know as to each use, what are some of the specific constraints and requirements, preconditions that are already built into the legislation. So when I say I think there's going to be a lot of follow-up, there's going to be a lot of follow-up even from our office as you start to dig in. But today's meeting is not the place to give you that enormous brain dump. That is just more, what I am anticipating or in fact encouraging is follow-up questions from the task force that start to probably every pun and also no pun intended get into the weeds. And that we can then address, including like in a written memo or something. You've asked the following questions. Well, here's the answers out of the statute. Here's what we don't know, but we hope regulations would address. So I just want to put that out there sort of as a general going forward, instruction or whatever, guidance.
Thank you. I did send, I think it was someone else in your office, Trishka, a kind of a panicked email, or I think actually Leticia did this as we were renewing revising the statute that includes mapping out the drug-free school zones and the drug-free
Yeah, you sent that to me.
Areas. And like the entire town is basically off limits if you look at that. So Leticia very smartly raised the question of, wait, what effect does this have on potential cannabis? So apparently it doesn't have that effect. So I guess advertising may be affected, but I mean, if you can't be within whatever a certain number of feet of a park or a public building or public housing or a school, essentially like the entire town would
right.
By mandate be dry. But we'll get to that when we talk a little bit more about zoning, which I'm hoping to do at our next meeting. So there were, I just want to, before we get to, there were a couple of questions, but I wonder if, I know Tricia, you indicated that nothing's going to happen anytime soon, but I know Hugh, we had touched on this in a conversation. So I'm wondering if you might want to speak about when you see like the first like potential dispensary in the state opening? Like, what is just a vague timeline that we might sort of hold in our heads as we move forward?
For
Just
adult use. All right,
to the
so
extent that you,
this is my guess, and don't beat me up on it. I am thinking maybe mid 2022. And why do I say that? We see some states like Arizona, and which passed an adult use law and within a couple of months was selling adult use. We saw Illinois, we saw Massachusetts had a ridiculous long period of time and still hasn't rolled out adult use. We see Illinois did a rollout of adult use. I think that we have certain notice requirements in our administrative law that actually can make full regulations extra time consuming. The licensing processes have, for a variety of reasons, taken a lot longer than people have thought. The amount of complexity in the law as well, every piece of complexity not only raises barriers to entry on particular applicants, but it also requires greater amounts of, by increasing costs and complexity, but also creates more time. The build outs of facilities have just been terrible. We've been so slow. This is an industry problem. This is not the state's problem. The state's been beside itself trying to rectify this. We have, with some noticeable exceptions, we've been really, really slow. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So you do need to have, partially because we've had such a small number of licenses that we've depended on, if we had a larger number of licenses, we would have had, less, would have been at the mercy of less, we wouldn't be quite at the mercy of less failure in getting going. But as it is right now, I think we have, a couple of 100,000 square feet of total canopy in the state. Canopy would be like, stuff growing. For adult use, we might, need a couple million square feet of canopy. So we don't have nearly enough of the supply that adult use would happen, because adult use, unlike medical, is going to really draw on the populations of our border states as well, particularly if they haven't gone adult use before we have. So we just don't have enough industry up and running to really service the amount of demand, and the amount of demand that will hit in New Jersey, pound for pound, is much more than would hit Arizona or even in Illinois or Massachusetts, just because of our location, the amount of the population on our borders. And what's more, all of those states, Arizona and Illinois, had far more in-place infrastructure to rely on, so they were able to move more quickly. We really need, before we can credibly open adult use without inviting just infrastructure chaos and everything being sold out and our medical patients being, left adrift, we really have to build this industry up from biomass on, and that's where both New York and New Jersey are in this problem, and it's going to take both of us a long time, a fair amount of time to get through not just the governmental part of it, but then the larger piece of getting the industry all up and running. Puts us a little bit at risk of having our lunch eaten by Pennsylvania, but because they do have enough infrastructure to probably, take a deep breath and turn on adult use if they could. We can't, New York can't credibly until we get more supply up.
thank you very much. That was just
My
helpful.
guess only.
So I know, Abby, you had a couple of questions, but you said they might be more related to medical. Do you want to?
I have a couple extra questions in addition to that.
Okay.
Um,
It would be Abby, then Colleen, then Udi, of the people I've seen who have questions.
One is right to what was just said, that the limitations to the cultivation. If we have such limitations to actually growing the canopy up to what is needed by the demand, why isn't it to be allowed? Why can't people cultivate outdoors? And is that some part of the law that people are trying to change in Trenton? Because it seems like, being the garden state, having outdoor grow would make sense, and it's environmentally less impactful than having indoor grow facilities. And then I also had a question about the licensing, like for micro businesses, the micro licenses, can they shift to regular licenses after a certain amount of time? And how does that process work and how does that look for a municipality?
Abby, is that for me or anyone? Okay. Okay, outdoor. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that we won't have outdoor at some point in time in New Jersey. I'm actually not sure. Maybe I'm wrong, that it's a foregone conclusion that it's prohibited even by the law fully. We'll see. Outdoor cultivation is a marvelously good idea. It's a remarkably good idea, provided that, and I think what's critically important for states that are worried about oversupply, counting licenses, like saying 37, 12, that's just silly, right? Because any one of the licenses otherwise constrained could do 1 million square feet on their own, and then you would just be owned by large corporate interests. The key to managing supply, whether to managing the amount of supply that's in the state, is to actually regulate the size of the canopy, regardless of outdoor or indoor. Outdoor cannabis is particularly good for utilize. It's less favorable for flower because of the potential for mycotoxins and other type of soil-based contaminants, although that can be managed remarkably well. But it's utilized very well for oils for extraction that's been used in edibles and other baby products because you can distill. And as I hear people say it, and I tend to believe it, that the terpene profile from outdoor grow, it can't be beat. So the terpenes are all the flavor and smell elements, right? So there's a lot of reason to see that. And I've seen in Maryland, there's some outdoor grow and it's done phenomenally well. And if regulated properly, there isn't this idea that we're going to have, endless fields of cannabis being diverted. I mean, these things can be as secure, as safe, and as effective as indoor. Probably not as reliably quality threshold. So I think it would be a marvelously good idea for us to have that. And that would actually help us get to scale sooner rather than later, because the amount of cannabis that you need for extraction is a lot. Micro, yeah, there's a, and we, by the way, we do have canopy carrying coming. It's just undetermined what that's going to be in our law. Micro, yeah, my understanding is micro licenses can apply, convert to regular license over by the commission. My understanding.
And if I could just ask one quick question about the medical, are they still required to be vertically integrated now?
No.
Or no?
No, in fact, the 2019 RFA, which we're still awaiting the results of, was the first RFA where we broke vertical integration. We did have 4 vertically integrated licensing opportunities in that round, but we had 5 standalone cultivation and we had 15 standalone dispensaries. We have in our law clinical registrant vertically integrated licenses, which is a complex matter and very limited. And then we have still, I think, 3 vertical licenses unaccounted for in our legislation, which would respectively be available. Then after that, we're moving ourselves to what would be a permissible vertical model, where if someone if an operator so desires and has the acumen and the capability, that operator can vertically integrate through the license class by making a showing in each case. We have limitations on horizontal integration, however. Horizontal integration going forward is how many of each license type you can have. And right now, for instance, in retail, go forward, it's going to be limited to 1 per customer. I could see that changing in the future when we have enough, but we want to have more people in the game. So you got to do something to get more diversity going on, or else we're just going to be soaked up by some well-established interests. So, yeah.
Thank you. Before I know Colleen and then Udi, but I just want to say as a kind of follow-up to the outdoor cultivation that you're also not allowed to grow your own at all, whether you're a medical marijuana patient or adult use, which is also something I know there's pressure on the state level to change. But
that should change. It's terrible. I've come around greatly to being a big proponent of having home grow after seeing it. I think it's we just have to do it. But look, homegrown that's the R&D engine for new strains for the industry in many places. I mean, we've got we've got, it's just crazy that we're not doing it. And it's not the case that you're going to see everyone growing weed everywhere. I mean, it's tough to do, right? It's tough to do. It's sort of like craft brewing. We allow craft brewing, but it's not happening on every street corner. It is a remarkably good idea for the enthusiast as well as for the committed or patient or the patient that has a specific need and, you know, otherwise is at the mercy of a supply chain that may drift away from that need. So yeah, it's a remarkably good idea, and I really hope our state does move forward with that legislation.
It also makes sense if you look at it in terms of, you know, the state, the overall intent being to try to regulate adult use cannabis the same way as you regulate alcohol. So, I mean, it would just seem logical. If you allow home brewing, why don't you allow homegrown?
I don't think logic has anything to do with it, but.
No, it really doesn't. I know. I heard it as it came out of my mouth. It is
Colleague,
Trenton after all.
you had a question?
Yeah, so this recent conversation sort of addresses my question. And where does the regulatory oversight of, you know, quality control, you know, growing and manufacturing, is that already written into law, or is that something that's still being developed? I mean, protecting our consumers, whether it's homegrown or.
It's definitely, there is a lot in this statute already on all of this. And from, you know, Hugh can correct me because I'm probably going to overstate, but the way as attorneys were reading the statute, it's almost like from the moment you put the seed into the ground until it's delivered to the consumer, it is tracked and regulated with stamps and barcodes. There are testing requirements along the way. You know, that's one thing Hugh and I didn't talk about is testing facilities, but there is already a lot in the statute in terms of quality control, labeling, tracking, I think all with an eye toward protecting the consumer. There's one of the things that was interesting to me, there is a lot already in the statute in terms of restrictions on packaging to not make it attractive to minors. And, you know, I think I saw in there somewhere, like, you can't make it look like a gummy bear, for instance. You know, so there's, and this is where I was saying, you know, as at the task force level, as you start to dig in, I think these are all things that we can look at, because there is a ton in here. And, you know, I think, and I've said this to some of my other clients, there may be some fears that municipalities have that are actually already answered and addressed by the legislation that may turn out not to be fears. But then there may be other things that we're not thinking about that could be, you know, negative consequences. So Hugh, I mean, I'm sure you can add or correct to what I just said, because you know it better. But
no, Trishka, I totally agree. I think that the law has that. Now the law has that, but it's not yet in place. So we really need regulation on that. And Dr. Nathan, who's on this Zoom, is quite expert in the labeling matter. So labeling, manufacturing regulations, testing, third-party testing labs. We don't have that. All testing right now is done by our state lab, and it's not adequate. Not that the state lab does a bad job. It's just that it's just not capable of doing everything plus testing stuff. So,
but the statute sets that up now.
Does
right?
set it up
the door to
nicely.
third-party testing.
It does. You're absolutely right, and it is a high priority for the commission. I think at the last meeting, and in our law, there's that really interesting provision to expedite this entire thing. There's this interesting provision, knowing how long regulations take in the state, that says, hey, until such time as you have drafted your own regulation, you may adopt the regulations of another state. And that's already doing this, and then adopt that regulation, and then that will get and then use like guidance mechanisms to deal with how the main focus of cannabis testing is you know, quality assurance, but it's safety. So you want to test against heavy metals, mycotoxins, pesticides, impermissible chemicals, and then potency, right? So that people know what they're getting, potency, and then after that, maybe like, you know, disclosure issues, like what's the terpene, are you getting what they're advertising? And hopefully that's all coming. We were very careful on that. It just hasn't really hit yet. It needs regulation.
Okay, I did have one other comment and one other question. I know we keep talking about the state of Massachusetts and their rollout. They just recently approved outdoor growing. And I wonder if they could be a model. I mean, they obviously have long considered this since they've had medical marijuana and indoor growing for, I think, almost 10 years now, and they've just approved outdoor growing. So they might help us, see what the challenges are around that or the considerations. And then my other question is, we need to get the medical community on board. I have a friend with Parkinson's disease and wanted to get a medical doctor to prescribe, and there aren't that many docs and locally that are willing to participate in writing scripts. So I guess hopefully that somewhere is coming down the pike too, right?
We actually have cannabis doctors in Princeton. So,
Okay.
we have some here, but yeah, we don't, we're moving on to adult use, and medical isn't really, hasn't fully flourished like it could, right? In every aspect. And the great fear is that on a good day, a medical market's no more than 10% of an adult use market. So the fear is like a drop going into a bathtub. The medical market will just diffuse away. And that's a great fear. And our law would have taken great strides to try and hopefully, and our commission will be dedicated to making sure the patients are not only currently taken care for, but our medical program remains viable and good. Yeah, but I'm with you. It's always a worry.
I do think the medical sales could go way up as this rolls out. I think it's a much underserved, part of the population. So you say it's only 10%, but anyway.
Well, no, just 10%. So if you go to another market where there is adult use, medical tends to drop down to somewhere around 10% of overall sales. No, medical, as far as the humans go, yeah, we want to see that grow. The fear is that when you have adult use, that medical gets obliterated.
Got it.
Right, because it's just so small comparatively.
Got it.
Thank you, Colleen. Udi, you had a couple of questions?
Yeah. So one question is on licensing and the other one is on enforcement. And I guess in particular, looking for Trishka's, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes.
Trishka's guidance, or at least views on this as the municipal attorney. So on the licensing, what is your position on what recommendations we can make around the criteria for who should be given a license by the municipality if we do decide to open particularly retail shops? So for example, adding a requirement that hire a certain percentage of employees who are formerly incarcerated or who is part of our social equity goals, right? Who have a record of marijuana conviction and who have felt the brunt of the war on drugs. And now we provide them with employment. So actually prioritizing that and including that as an explicit criteria, either to get a license or to be employed. And there are a lot of ways to do it, but in general, what is your position on that? And then secondly, on enforcement, what is your position on the ability of this task force to provide recommendations to the police department and to the prosecutor's office and how to use its discretion? And specifically on the home grow prohibition, which I'm hearing many people say that they disagree with. The city, the municipality of Princeton can take the position that it will make it a lowest enforcement priority in terms of whether to actually enforce the home grow prohibition. In the early days of the movement to legalize marijuana, that was a tactic that was adopted across the country, right? Where local prosecutors, local police chiefs would issue orders saying, yes, it is illegal under state law, but we are making it the lowest enforcement priority. We're using our discretion as the police. We're using our discretion as prosecutors. This is a tactic that we see deployed in a whole host of issues all across the country. So what is your position on the task force's purview to make that as a recommendation for the police chief or the chief prosecutor or the mayor or the city council, right? To say, here, we understand that this is outside of our jurisdiction and that we don't create state law, but we don't think that should be an enforcement priority for the municipality of Princeton.
So in terms of your first question, I can't right now tell you, could you require that, the businesses hire a certain number of, the examples that you gave. There is a lot in the statute. Whatever is in the statute will override anything that you can control locally. That's sort of a general, the legal principle is preemption. So on those types of questions and recommendations, I would need to have the specific question and then go back and dig through the statute, because there aren't really going to necessarily be blanket answers. And I think this is where, as the task force is moving forward, especially as the subcommittee level, as you guys identify things that you would like in an ideal world, identify them, put the question to me, and then we'll be able to give you a very targeted and more accurate answer than trying to deal with it in the abstract. But I will say this, there may be things that you want to be able to do that we'll say to you, nope, that's already dealt with by the state. You don't have that ability. There may be things where we think that is sort of within the range of what we can control locally. But I would say, and this goes back to the how versus the what versus the how, at least identify your wish list, and there may be things that we say, no, forget it. That's not going to be possible. Other things will be, but I want you to focus on your wish list. And, ideally, if all options were available to you, this is what you would want. In terms of enforcement, the answer is you have zero ability to tell the police or the prosecutors how to enforce. None. It's called prosecutorial discretion. Any more than you can't say to the police, we want you to ignore speeding on X type of, on X and such road because we think the speed limit is silly. You have no ability. It's entirely up to the police and to the prosecutors. What you can say, and I would, based on some of the questions and the comments today, it almost, and obviously it's going to be up to the task force. But what I'm hearing and what's coming into my head as I'm listening to people and seeing the questions and the comments, it's almost like this task force could potentially have two parts, or two steps. The initial step, figure out what the recommendations are as to Princeton specifically. But then if an outgrowth of that and an outgrowth of what you're looking at suggests legislative amendments, I think it's entirely within your purview to make those recommendations, such as, hey, we've looked at everything within existing constraints. This is what we think would make sense for the municipality. However, we just want to flag. Legislation currently prohibits home growing. We've looked at it. We would urge, the council may want to approach Trenton about getting that changed. Here are some things that elected officials, may want to think about trying to shift away from. You could say through that, not enforcement. You have no ability, and neither does the governing body, to talk about enforcement, but you can talk about legislative changes.
I understand.
That have the same effect.
I didn't say we should tell the police department what to do.
Even suggest, you can't.
Right. Why do you say we cannot suggest?
That's just the law. You can't.
Where is that the law? Wait, hold on. Where is that the law that a task force of the city cannot make a suggestion to the police department that they make something a lowest enforcement priority?
The police department answers to the county and to the state attorney general on the enforcement of laws.
I think what we can do and what we have done in the past, for example, the council passed an ordinance, expressing our support for undocumented immigrants and, indicating that the sense of the community is that we didn't want our police. So we can do things like that. And I certainly hope that we will. And I think I've stressed that all along, that, the community's moral values need to be a part of what we do, but we can't tell. We can only say the community that you're working in, and these are our values. So
I agree. Even this is a place where you have to have very careful wording, so while you can't make suggestions about, this should be a low enforcement priority, I agree entirely with Eve. as as elected officials, as task force members, you are speaking and trying to reflect the values of the community and expressing those values. You can't go beyond that, but that is entirely appropriate and within the purview of the elected officials. And therefore, if the task force makes recommendations to elected officials, that could be part of it. But again, it's very careful how that's couched and what language is used and how it's expressed. So that's where wordsmithing becomes important.
Yeah, on that example that you gave, Eve, our former chief of police, Chief Sutter, actually worked with Human Services to issue a police directive to our officers that they were not going to be the ones, that we don't enforce immigration law. So they would not be working with ICE to enforce immigration laws.
And
There was a nuance to that. Yeah, I mean, yes, you're.
Yeah.
There are still certain federal requirements that the police have to observe, but they weren't going to go one step beyond the minimum that they were required to comply with. No, I agree with you, Eve. And I think, the caveat to that is it is still up to the chief at the end of the day.
Yes.
But an expression of values, of priority, what the local officials, elected officials are placing, priority on in terms of tone and all the rest, that's appropriate. After that, it's entirely up to the police and the prosecutors how to implement, because they are under the oversight of the state and the county, and ultimately that's who they answer to.
And Leticia, you had
I do, yes. And some of, actually my questions, Trishka, I believe you already answered through emails previously, but just for the benefit of the task force, one is whether our housing authorities that receive federal funding, and that would also include universities, colleges that perhaps prohibit cannabis use in their dorms, or in the housing authorities and public housing, whether they can prohibit tenants from consuming cannabis on their.
I know as to the housing authority, Ed Schmier had addressed that. I apologize for not recalling off the top of my head what the ins and outs were of his answer. I think if he provided it in writing, we can absolutely share that. And I think he did. We can share that with the task force. In terms of, college campuses, I mean, it's, they can do with cannabis that's, they'll have, I think, the same flexibility and discretion as they would with alcohol use. I don't see any difference, quite frankly. I mean, I'm trying to remember back to eons ago when I was in college, and I know our school, even though it was a drinking school, there were all kinds of rules in terms of what you could or couldn't have in your dorm room that, predictably were completely ignored.
Kristen, can I put you on the spot here? Because I don't actually think that's true. I think that because cannabis is illegal nationally, that actually no cannabis use is allowed on campus. But Kristen is our university.
Can I just say, Eve, we finally arrived at the moment we knew we would arrive at, where I would say something off the top of my head, guessing, and get it wrong. This is fantastic.
No, but that's not what we heard about public housing that receives federal funding. We were told that tenants would be, they would not be prohibited from consuming in the privacy of their own home.
Okay.
So, Eve, I'll preface my comment by I'm the community affairs director for the university. I'm not a lawyer. And if we wanted to go very deep into this, I'd need to have someone from the university. But my understanding, from my level of understanding, and of course, as has been said at all points today, the regulations are still being, finalized. And cannabis remains prohibited on campus under federal law. It's a Schedule I controlled substance, and that with limited exceptions, manufacture, distribution, and possession is a federal crime. So I can't go into any more detail than that. That's what I understand of the law right now as a non-lawyer.
I'm sure your attorneys are working on this as well. And as they maybe have information that would be helpful to share with us, that would be.
To the extent that to the extent that the committee has specific questions that would be of interest for us to respond to, it'd be helpful for me to be able to have that. As we've said, Trishka providing information, if it can be fed to me, I can, get the appropriate people to, respond.
Go ahead, and then Kathy has a question.
I had a follow-up too after Hugh.
Oh, I was gonna, Leticia, your concerns that you raised were actually part of the motivation for the inclusion of social consumption in the medical law of 2019, because there was a view that particularly in urban communities, that people who, patients who were in federally subsidized housing were subject to eviction for cannabis consumption. And then there was nowhere else, really bad weather for them to go. And so there was a view that, well, like, okay, if we're still living in a world where certain types of people, particularly the vulnerable people, are being excluded for something that someone with more money and with a house could do, we need to allow for the possibility for a place, a venue for people to go and not risk disenfranchisement in any capacity. So that's actually, it's sort of floating behind prudentially, but also from a justice point of view. The idea of social consumption isn't just like we want to have a cool place to hang out and smoke weed, but there's actually some significantly good reasons for it. Just flagging that for the future.
Great, good to know. And so then my follow-up question relates to employers who are now doing drug testing as a condition of employment. And so my question is whether, cannabis being legalized in New Jersey, whether that would play a role there.
It plays a role. There are there are rules and then exceptions and then nuances and then exceptions. And that's one of these follow-ups where I could give you the more specific answer, because there's also then medical cannabis consumption and use also factors into that. But yes, there are some very specific sort of provisions and ground rules now, on the employment end, things that employers can and can't require and limit, and then exceptions to those exceptions.
Okay, look forward to hearing more, learning more. Thanks.
All right, and Kathy Stillo, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you. I've been thinking a lot about just how helpful it would be to have a blueprint, and maybe we reach out to Boulder, Colorado, or find some analog towns, university towns, something that kind of has a look and feel like Princeton, and just like send us everything you have, right? So that would include all of their Department of Health kind of language about, messaging around use of cannabis, all of the kind of restrictions around zoning, how many dispensaries or storefronts did they have, just so that we could have a better idea of what has been successful in the past and don't have to go topic by topic and try to figure it out on our own, but to have something more wrapped up as a like, here, this is what we did and here's how it played out in reality would be really helpful. Is it possible to do that?
So I'll say sure. I mean, that's something I've been thinking about. I mean, the state law is going to be noticeably different, but some of the things you mentioned, like the health department regulations or how you deal with complaints about noise or smell, or in the case of if you have a compressor, those are things that we could definitely, I think, piggyback from other communities, and absolutely, that'll be part of the work of the subcommittee. So I don't know if you just volunteered to reach out to Boulder.
I don't know it. I don't know Boulder, but I'm happy to. It's like if you were in business school, you'd be looking at case studies. Like I'm looking for case studies.
Yeah.
I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of identifying, positive and negative impacts of the different types of, businesses and uses. And I think, as you pointed out, Kathy, like even in terms of, the number of retailers or things like that, in terms of then just trying to import regulatory language, I would definitely want to look at it. I would not want to rely on it, because New Jersey is just so freaking different. And you just can't, any number of areas, it's just proved to be very difficult to do that. But I do think in terms of at least understanding, the impacts, the good and the bad, and the issues that they've had to address, and, things that they didn't think would be a problem that turned out to be a problem, and things that they thought would be a problem that turned out not to be. I would absolutely look at Massachusetts, Colorado, other states that have come before New Jersey, and definitely draw on those experiences. I think that's a very, very good idea.
Thank you for that suggestion, Kathy. And Colleen, I saw you do your hand up again.
I just said, yeah, I think Trishka addressed what I was going to say, which is I think that we could benefit as much from what didn't work as did work. And I think Colorado in particular has been criticized for having a very sloppy rollout and, having a lot of growing pains along the way, because I think they really leapt in with 2 feet first and stumbled. So, I mean, maybe Boulder would be a study in what not to do, right? And that's it.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think that we should all think about what towns are comparable to Princeton that have had the experience of legal or possibly even medical marijuana, and reaching out to those towns to learn what we can, I think is really a great idea. So I've been kind of thinking in my head about what towns are comparable. Boulder's larger than us, but does have and has a larger university. But I don't know. Anyway, we can think about
I was gonna
that.
say, I have connections in Washington State, so I can look to see if we can find a comparable there.
Excellent. And I don't see any other hands up, and we're a tiny bit over. So I want to thank Hugh and Trishka for really just great, I think, very on point presentations, really addressing a lot of the things that we need to know to move on in our decisions. And as I said last night, I sent out emails with people's assignments for the subcommittees. So we'll get the first meetings of those groups up and running. We have our regular time going forward, second Thursday of every month. And I think the next month, continuing our kind of focus on the subcommittee work, although I'm hoping the following month to move to kind of the subcommittee 2 focus for the whole group. But continuing the focus on the making a decision that we need to do, hearing from our zoning and planning officers, and Hugh might have a guest who he might be able to ask to come on as well, talking about land use and just get an overview of what some of the considerations that the task force will have to encounter as they move forward, assuming that we do want to explore the possibility of opening to some part of the industry in the long run. And that's it. We've saved the chat. This recording will somehow be magically available. I'll let you know when that's the case. So Trishka, you can send it out to your friends and colleagues. And, please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions, or Leticia and Michelle as well. And thank you so much for your time this morning.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.